Hello everyone, and welcome back to Christian Ambassador Training. This is the 9th week of our Genesis study, and today we are looking at Genesis 12, verse 4, through the end of chapter 13. If you'd like to follow along, go ahead and turn there now. Now, Genesis 12 tells the story of Abraham's journey. Well, at this point, he's Abram. Abram's journey from Haran down to Egypt, then back up to Canaan. And here's a picture of his path. So this is the first arrow here on the right side is his family's journey from up to Haran, where they stopped, and then Abram gets the call of God, and he journeys from Haran down to Canaan, and then on through Canaan to Egypt. And then he gets kicked out of Egypt by the Pharaoh, as we'll see, and he returns to Canaan. Now, there are a lot of things going on in this story, and we just don't have time to go through all of them, let's be honest. So I'm going to focus in on two particular things going on that I think, one I think is the core message of the story, and the other, I think, is an underlying message that gets picked up later in the narrative. So I want to focus on this underlying narrative first. So the first thing that we see going on here is God is giving a warning to Egypt. In verses 10 through 20, God is warning Egypt. He does this a lot in the Old Testament, and it really highlights his mercy. Even though these societies that he is going to judge, even though they're corrupt, deeply corrupt, he still gives them the chance to recognize their error, repent, and be saved. A classic example is the story of Jonah, where God sends Jonah to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, and tells them to repent of their wicked ways, to repent of their violence, to repent of the way that they're going out and enslaving peoples and bringing them in order to sustain their tyranny. And in a similar way here, what's going on is God is sending Abram because Egypt is starting to take on some of the earmarks of a tyranny. And what's happening is they're not treating the stranger well, because what happens? Abram goes down to Egypt, and before he gets there, he warns his wife. He says, "Sarai, you're a beautiful woman. And if we go down there and we tell them that you're my wife, they're going to kill me and they're going to take you from me." And we see that in the story. He says, when the Egyptians see you, they will say, "This is his wife," and they will kill me. And this is an indication that the Egyptians used foreigners. They used the stranger. Instead of treating them as someone who's an equal, instead of treating them as someone to befriend and to develop mutual beneficial relationships with, they treated the foreigner as someone to use. Someone that they could bring in and be like, "Oh, here's this stuff. This is all nice, but you have to give us what we want. You have to fit into our system. And if you don't fit into our system, then you're not welcome here." And that's the way that the Egyptians treat Abram. They bring him in and they give him all kinds of things, but in exchange, he has to surrender Sarah. And they do this with the Israelites later. It becomes clear that Egypt did not learn their lesson. And when the Israelites get there, they're treated well at first, but when they don't fit into the system, when they start to proliferate and they don't submit themselves to Egypt's culture, and they start to become independently wealthy and independent, not dependent on Egypt's good graces, not subject to their whims, they enslave them. And that's what a tyranny does, is it brings these strangers in. The tyranny, it loses its it loses its life. because a tyranny, it develops, there's someone at the top who has all the power, and it develops this whole system that is brittle and is locked in, and you have to fit into that system. But the problem is, in order to make people fit into that system, they have to expend energy in order to keep them from shifting and bucking the system. And so there's all the people inside fighting each other, fighting themselves, in order to force the other people, the people below them, to fit into the system so that they can use their power to empower themselves. It's a Ponzi scheme. And then what happens is they run out of resources, and they have to bring strangers in, entice them in with wealth and with comfort and things like that. But then they take from them their resources. They take from them their future and their freedom. And they become this bottom tier, the new bottom tier of the pyramid, which is an appropriate metaphor given that we're talking about Egypt. So that's how a tyranny abuses the stranger. There's another way that the stranger can be abused in a corrupt society, and that's in a society that's falling to the dissolution of chaos. And we'll see that in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. But for now, Egypt is starting to show signs of this kind of tyrannical behavior towards outsiders, and God is warning them. He's saying, you need to stop this, or judgment is coming. And they ignore the warnings. They push Abram out and say, we don't really know what's going on. They recognize that something has gone wrong, but they don't want to go to the effort of figuring out what it is. And so instead of allowing Abram to stay and figuring out what it is that they're doing wrong with the stranger, they just push him out. And it redounds to their judgment later when they try to enslave the Israelites. And that, again, is a common theme throughout, is Israel. They go to Egypt for safety, for security, for provision, and Egypt gives them that and asks and tries to take away their future in exchange, because Egypt is the quintessential tyranny in the Bible. So the other thing that's happening in this story is that Abram is undergoing a classic hero origin story. So there's different ways that hero origin stories can happen, but one of the most well-known and most commonly seen ways is this sort of death and resurrection metaphor that happens. And of course it happens literally with Christ, because he is the ultimate archetype to which all the heroes, all the stories about heroes, the reason we love listening to stories about heroes is because they all point to Christ. They all point to that ultimate hero who died, who actually died, and was actually rose from the dead. And so these stories have three stages. The first stage is the hero fails, the hero falls. This is the death. He comes up against something and can't overcome it, and he is destroyed by it. And then the second step is the hero descends into the underworld. This is called KATABASIS, and this can be either literal or figurative. You'll notice the pictures that I have here. Let me go back and explain this first picture. This is from the movie Iron Man 2. And if you haven't seen it, spoiler alert, I'm going to be explaining some of the plot points. So Iron Man, here in this story, he's dealing with a personal issue, and he gets out of control. And his friend Rhodey comes and takes his spare Iron Man suit and basically lays the smackdown on him, and leaves with his suit. And it's this like moment of failure where all the things that Iron Man has been ignoring and just trying to sort of keep going and keep going and keep going and ignore the problems, ignore the underlying issues that are starting to build up, they all kind of come crashing to the forefront, and he falls through into failure and into the underworld. And what happens in the underworld is the hero discovers something, some long lost piece of culture or magic or power. So he gains some power in the underworld that he didn't have before. And Iron Man is a really great case of this, because really all three of the Iron Man stories are this same sort of origin story. It's kind of funny. It's like Iron Man is born 3 times in the trilogy, which is a little bit funny. But his character is like that. He's a deeply flawed character, and so he has to get beaten down again and again in order to fix his character flaws. And in this story, he discovers something that his father had discovered, that he couldn't create at the time, but with modern technology, Iron Man can create it, and it solves the problem that he's been having. And so this is the classic hero story of this descent into the underworld. And in ancient mythology and a lot of times in literary analysis, this is called the KATABASIS. It's the descent into the underworld. It could be, again, a literal underworld, like in the case of the Odyssey or the Iliad, or it could be a figurative underworld, like in this case, where he's locked in his house and spends a whole bunch of time down in his basement figuring all this stuff out. And then with that, the new knowledge, the new power, the hero integrates that into himself and returns from the underworld ready to fight the evil that he failed against before. And this is called the Anabasis, the return from the underworld. And in this story, Iron Man uses the technology that his father had discovered, and he integrates it into his suit, and it solves the problem that he'd been having that had been threatening his life, and he's able to return as the Iron Man hero to the scene just in the nick of time, of course, because it's Hollywood. Now, in the story of Abraham, this is essentially the story that's happening. So he gets out. He obeys the command. Remember, God gives this command: get out from your house, from your country, from your father's household, and unto a land that I will show you. And he does this, and he gets out. But he's still deeply flawed. He's still, he doesn't have what he needs to take possession of the land that God promises him. So he gets to Canaan, and God says, this is the land I will give to you. And it's like, great, what now? He's got nothing. He left everything behind. He has no monetary possessions. He's got no family. He left his family behind. He has Lot with him, but Lot is destitute as well, and he's younger than Abram. So he has nothing. And he doesn't even have faith really yet, because he doesn't know God yet. He hasn't had any experience with God. So he's stuck. He's abandoned the power that he had in the old world, but he hasn't abandoned the old world's mindset and the old world's way of thinking about things. He still doesn't recognize that the God that he serves is powerful enough to give him the things that he's been promised. So he gets this promise. He builds an altar to the Lord, but then he keeps on journeying. He keeps on going because he doesn't see how he's going to be able to get what God has promised him here in the land of Canaan. And so he just keeps on going, keeps on doing what he's been doing. And he journeys on still towards the south. And we see pretty clearly that this was the wrong decision, because what does he hit next? He hits a famine. He comes across, there's a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt. So he hits a famine. Instead of saying, oh, maybe God's trying to tell me something here, he he keeps going. He says, okay, well, there's a famine. What do I do? I'm just going to go to Egypt. They've got food. They've got the Nile River, and that never runs out of water. And so they're rich. They have food for me. And this is the common thing that happens in the Bible. Like I mentioned before, Israel runs into a problem that they don't see how to deal with on their own power. And instead of trusting God, they turn to Egypt. And Egypt offers them protection, offers them provision to get through if it's a natural disaster or if it's an opposing army that's invading them. Egypt offers them troops and protection, but in exchange, they turn Israel into slaves. They try to take away Israel's future. We see that here in this story when Pharaoh tries to take away Sarah from Abram. And Sarah she's the one that God has promised Abram that he would make a great nation out of him. And Sarah is his wife. She's the one through whom the child of promise will come. He doesn't know that yet, but that's God's plan. And Egypt tries to take Sarah from him. And later on, when there's another famine, Abram's descendants go down to Egypt to get food, to get provision. And what happens a couple generations later? Egypt enslaves them and tries to kill all of their male children, tries to wipe them out as a race and take their future from them. So this is the role that Egypt plays in the Bible. Is they're that tyranny that offers to the stranger, offers to the outsider, hey, we've got what you need. We'll give you what you need, free of charge. All we ask in exchange is your future. All we ask in exchange is your freedom. And that is the siren's call of tyranny. And you need to watch out for it. Because it's always being given. There's always those that say, I will take care of you. I will give you what you need to survive. I'll keep you safe. I'll provide for you. All you have to give me in exchange is your freedom. Just give me the power to provide for you, and I'll do it for you. That's the siren's call of tyranny, and it needs to be rejected. So what happens down in Egypt? Well, in spite of Abram's failings, God comes through. He plagues Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. And this is, in part, there's two things going on here. God is showing Abram that he will provide for him, that Abram doesn't have to rely on the city of man, and that he should not rely on the city of man, because the city of man, it's a siren's call. Like I said, they offer you everything, but they take your future. And instead, God's saying, rely on me. And on the other hand, God is saying to Egypt, look, the way you're treating strangers, it's so terrible that this person who came to you for help felt like he had to lie to you to save his own life. You're clearly doing something wrong. You need to treat the stranger better. You need to treat the stranger like a friend, like someone that has something to offer, that you can get some mutual exchange with, instead of just slotting them into your system, taking what you want from them and giving them your sort of leavings. That's not how to treat the stranger. You treat the stranger like an individual with a free will of their own. And that's not how Egypt was treating them. Egypt was treating them like a tool. And so God sends this shot across the bow of Egypt. He says, look, if you don't straighten up your act, if you don't start to act like other people matter, if you don't start to look to the stranger as someone with something significant to offer, as someone with something to offer that might be a corrective for your kingdom, that might give you a new way of doing things, you're going to fall, because you're going to become brittle and you're going to break down. So then what happens next is they find out, basically, there's all these plagues, and Pharaoh is like, well, what happened? Well, it all started, the problems, I don't know what happened, but the problems all started when I tried to take this man's sister to be my wife. And somehow he figures out, either figures out or God directly tells him that Sarah is actually Abram's wife. And so he's like, Abram, why did you lie to me? What's wrong with you? Why'd you lie to me? You know, as though it's not obvious that his men would have killed Abram. Why'd you lie to me? And then he kicks him out of Egypt. So Abram goes up from Egypt back to the south, which is, it could be translated as the Negev, which is a region down there between Egypt and Canaan. So Abram goes back up from Egypt to the south, and he's very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. And this is, again, it's God's provision. It's God's sign to Abram that God's going to be the one to take care of him, that he doesn't need to worry about all of these earthly possessions and things, and having earthly power and politicking and all that stuff. He doesn't need to try to gain power that way, because God has his back, and God is powerful enough to carry out his promises. And there's something else going on here too, I think, that in the ancient world, there's this mindset of territoriality, and each of the gods, they were just kind of, there's this idea that the gods kind of had their territory, and outside that territory, they didn't have any real power. And the Babylonians, they had their territory up here, and that territory belonged to Marduk, the Babylonian head god. And the territory down here in Egypt, that belonged to Ra, their head god. And here in Canaan was this kind of no man's land. There's several gods that were kind of treated as the main god, Baal being one, Moloch being another one. Ashtoreth was Baal's consort, and sometimes she was considered the head goddess there. And so it was a little bit under dispute. And so Abram might have been thinking when he was there, like, oh, well, maybe, you know, Yahweh, my God, is one of the gods of this territory, and he's trying to make a play for preeminence in this area. And then when the famine hits, Abram feels like, oh, he's not powerful enough to provide for me. He's not powerful enough to take care of me. And so he goes down and he goes to Egypt and to the land of Ra. But then what happens? God's power breaks through in the very stronghold of one of the two main deities of that time period. And what God is teaching Abram is that I'm not a God of this land or a God of that land. I'm the God of everything. I am the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, the God of gods. I am the one and the only true God. That's what he's teaching to Abram. And it seems like Abram learns this lesson. He comes back up to the south, and then what he does is he journeys, backtracking along his journey that he took to the south. He journeys back up to Bethel, where he had his altar at the first, and he calls on the name of the Lord again. And then what happens there is there's this test. So he calls on the name of the Lord, and the next thing that happens, we see that Abram and Lot are both incredibly rich, and there's not enough to sustain both of them. And so something has to give. And there's several ways that Abram could deal with this. So if he was still insisting on doing things his way, he could say, okay, Lot, look, you need to get your men in line. I'm the patriarch. I'm the elder. I'm the one that's in charge. You need to get your men in line, and you know, they'll just have whatever's left over when my men are done with their flocks. And he could have done that. He would have had the absolute right to do that because he was basically Lot's adoptive father. He also could have said to Lot, listen, we can't, this land isn't enough to sustain both of us. I'm going to go pick the choice land, and you are on your own. You kind of do you, and I'm just going to go over here where there's nice land, lots of grass, it's very fertile, and I'm going to take this land. And he would have, again, had the right to do that because he was the elder. It was a patriarchal society, and he had the absolute rights over Lot. But instead, what he does is he tells Lot, please, let there be no strife between us, or between my herdsmen and your herdsmen. Please separate from me. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. And Lot looks up and he sees the valley of Jordan, and he sees that it's fertile and that it's like Egypt, which we'll get back to. Lot here is kind of being designated by the narrator as sort of the anti-hero. So he's the one that holds on to his allegiance to the city of man. Even though he sees that Abram has the right idea and that Abram's God might be the true God. He still can't give up the conveniences of the city. And so he goes down to the Valley of Jordan and he settles in the plains next to the city of Sodom, which factors in later. Abram, on the other hand, he stays where he's at, in the less fertile land, but the land that God had promised him. And he shows by that he's not preoccupied with the world's standards of living anymore, that he's shifted his perspective, that he recognizes that God is the Lord of the whole earth. And if this is the land that God has for him, then this is the best land for him to have. And so he stays where God places him, and he kind of gives up his perspective on what he thought he wanted, and instead looks to God's promises. God had promised him, I will give this land to you and your descendants. And he says, all right, I'm going to trust that promise. I don't see how it's going to happen. I don't see how this land is better than the land that Lot took, but I'm going to trust that promise anyways. And in response, God rewards him. God comes to Abram again, and he says, after Lot had separated from him, and he does two things. First, he reaffirms and solidifies the promise he's already given. He says, lift up your eyes, look to the north, the south, the east, and the west. All this land that you see, I will give to you and your descendants. Actually, he doesn't say I will. He says, I give to you and your descendants forever. So he reaffirms this promise and solidifies it, makes it more tangible, more like Abram can really see it. And then the second thing he does is he expands on this promise. And he says, not only will I give you land, but your descendants will be like the sands of the sea. And this is a repeated theme, again, in the life of Abram, that each time he learns to trust God's promise and to trust God's perspective on things and his way of doing things, there's this test, and he passes the test. He shows that he's learned his lesson, and then God reaffirms the promise that he gave and expands it and makes it bigger, makes it more real, more obvious, the sort of path that he has for Abram. And it's the same thing God does with us. God calls us out, and we make mistakes. We take the wrong path. We're foolish and short-sighted, and we try to do things our way, even if we accept the goal that God gives us. Sometimes we try to accomplish that goal using our means. That's kind of what Abram does, right? He tries to accomplish God's goal of giving him the land by kind of wandering through it and building altars all over the place and being like, I'm here, this is my land, sort of. But it doesn't work out, right? Because our way of doing things is insufficient. It's not enough to take God's goals. We've got to take God's means as well. And God's patient with us, and he's merciful to us. And even though we cling to our old way of seeing things, our old way of doing things, God still has mercy and grace, and he blesses us anyways. And he shows us that our old way of doing things is not going to work, and that his way of doing things is the only way to blessing and joy and peace, if we'll just change our perspective, if we'll just accept the fact that he is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, and that there is no God beside him.